What would you do if a homeless man walked up to you and asked for just $1? Most people would ignore him. Some might toss a coin without a second glance. But when Robert De Niro was faced with that exact situation, his response left everyone speechless. Before we continue, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We love seeing how far our stories reach. It was a quiet evening on Melrose Avenue, Los Angeles. The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange hues. At a small outdoor cafe, Robert De Niro sat alone, sipping his coffee. Despite his sunglasses covering half his face, his unmistakable presence made people steal glances, whispering among themselves. Across the street, Kevin stood in torn clothes, gripping a small cardboard sign. His stomach twisted with hunger. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Every step he took felt like a battle against the weight of shame. But hunger had a way of pushing pride aside. Taking a deep breath, Kevin crossed the street and stopped beside Robert's table. His voice trembled as he asked, "Sir, can you spare $1?" For a moment, there was silence. Then, Robert De Niro slowly looked up. What he did next left everyone watching in shock. Robert De Niro removed his sunglasses, his sharp eyes locking onto Kevin. There was no anger, no irritation, just a quiet, intense curiosity. $1, huh?" he said, leaning back in his chair. His tone was unreadable. Kevin felt his chest tighten. He had expected a quick dismissal, maybe a few coins tossed his way. Instead, De Niro was studying him, as if trying to figure out the story behind the dirt-streaked face and worn-out clothes. The silence stretched. Kevin's hands fidgeted at his sides. He was about to apologize and walk away when De Niro suddenly gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down," he said. "Let's talk." Kevin froze. Was this some kind of joke? Sit down? With Robert De Niro? He scanned the actor's face, searching for a hint of sarcasm, but there was none. Only calm curiosity. Swallowing his nerves, Kevin pulled out the chair and sat. His hands trembled slightly as he placed his cardboard sign on the table, trying not to attract attention. For the first time in a long while, someone wasn't looking away. Someone was listening. And as Kevin opened his mouth to speak, he had no idea that this conversation would change his life forever. Kevin hesitated, his throat dry. He wasn't used to people actually wanting to hear his story. Most just walked past, eyes averted, pretending he didn't exist. But here he was, sitting across from Robert De Niro. I'm sorry if I bothered you," Kevin stammered, his voice raw. I don't like asking for money. I've been trying to find work, but," he exhaled sharply, looking down at his trembling hands, "it's harder than I thought." De Niro didn't say anything. He just listened. Not with pity, not with judgment. Just quiet, genuine attention. Kevin swallowed hard. He hadn't planned to spill his life story, but suddenly the words started tumbling out. "I was a contractor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Had my own crew. We built homes, good ones. I had a house, a family. And then the recession hit." His jaw tightened. The jobs dried up. The savings disappeared. Before I knew it, the bank took everything. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Funny, isn't it? I spent my life building homes, and now I can't even afford a place to sleep." De Niro's face remained unreadable, but something in his expression softened. Kevin shifted uncomfortably. "I know you probably get asked for things all the time," he mumbled. "I don't mean to be just another guy with his hand out. He trailed off, his voice cracking. "I don't know what else to do anymore." De Niro leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The air between them felt heavier now, like the world had slowed for this conversation. And then he asked a question Kevin never expected. "What's your name?" Kevin blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. Kevin," he muttered. De Niro nodded as if letting the name settle in his mind. Then, after a long pause, he said, "You know, Kevin, I've played a lot of characters in my life. Gangsters, cops, fighters. And you know what I've learned?" Kevin shook his head. "Every one of them had a story," De Niro said. "Good, bad, ugly. It didn't matter. What mattered was how they carried it. He leaned in slightly, his gaze locking onto Kevin's. "So tell me, what's the next chapter of your story?" Kevin froze. The next chapter, he hadn't thought about that in years, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't know how to answer. Kevin felt his chest tighten. The next chapter, did he even have one? Survival had been his only goal for so long that he hadn't thought beyond the next meal, the next night on the street. "I don't know," Kevin admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I just want to make it through the day." De Niro's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in thought. "That's not a chapter, Kevin. That's a sentence." His voice was steady, but there was something firm in it. "You need a real chapter, something you can build on." Kevin let out a shaky breath. He wanted to argue, to say that De Niro didn't understand what it was like to lose everything. But something about the way the actor spoke made him hold his tongue. This wasn't a lecture. It was a challenge. De Niro reached into his pocket, and Kevin braced himself. This was it, the moment where he'd pull out a few crumpled bills, hand them over, and send Kevin on his way, just like everyone else. But that's not what happened. Instead, De Niro pulled out a small business card and slid it across the table. "Go here," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's a shelter run by an old friend of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find a job, maybe even a place to stay, but," he added, his voice lowering slightly, "you have to take the first step." Kevin stared at the card, his hands trembling slightly. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" De Niro's expression softened. "Because someone did it for me once," he said simply, "and I wouldn't be sitting here if they hadn't." Kevin's fingers hovered over the card. It felt like a lifeline, but at the same time the weight of his past, his failures, his doubts, they all tugged at him. "I don't know, man," Kevin said after a long silence. "I've tried places like this before. They don't really help guys like me." De Niro's gaze didn't waver. "People like you? What does that even mean?" Kevin swallowed hard, avoiding his stare. "You wouldn't get it. Guys like me, we're just forgotten." De Niro leaned forward again, his voice quieter now, but sharper. "You think I've never been down?" he asked. "You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world, and nobody's there to help you lift it?" Kevin looked up, startled. De Niro's face was calm, but his words carried weight. "I grew up dirt poor," he continued. "My father walked out when I was a kid. I know what it's like to struggle, Kevin. But let me tell you something. It's not about how hard you fall, it's about whether you get back up." The words hit Kevin harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to tell De Niro that his life wasn't some Hollywood movie where things magically turned around. But deep down, he knew De Niro was right. Kevin sat there staring at the small business card on the table. It was just a piece of paper. Yet it felt heavier than anything he'd ever held. A chance, a choice, a way out. His fingers twitched, but he didn't pick it up. De Niro watched him carefully, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I get it," he said. "Change is scary." Kevin let out a hollow laugh. "Scary? It's impossible." De Niro shook his head. "Number. It just feels that way. But the truth is, Kevin, the only thing keeping you stuck is you." Kevin felt a sharp pang in his chest. He wanted to deny it, to push back, to say that life had been unfair, that he hadn't chosen to end up like this, but deep down he knew De Niro was right. Still, the fear remained. "What if I fail?" he asked, barely above a whisper. De Niro leaned forward again, his voice steady, unwavering. "Then you try again." Kevin exhaled, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "And what if I don't deserve it?" De Niro's expression hardened. "You do." Kevin blinked. He wasn't expecting that. "I don't know," he muttered. "I've made too many mistakes, burned too many bridges." De Niro tapped the table lightly. "Let me tell you something. You think you're the only one who's screwed up? You think I've never made mistakes? You think the people at that shelter haven't made mistakes?" Kevin didn't respond. "You're not defined by what you've done, Kevin. De Niro continued. You're defined by what you do next. Kevin swallowed hard. His gaze drifted back to the card. Look, De Niro said, his voice softer now. I'm not here to force you into anything, but I am telling you, this is your moment. You can either keep doing what you've been doing, keep struggling, keep surviving, keep convincing yourself that you don't deserve better, he paused, or you can take the first step toward something different. Kevin felt something shift inside him. Fear, hope, a battle between the two. He hesitated, just for a moment. And then, with a slow, shaky breath, he reached forward and picked up the card. Kevin turned the small card over in his hands, his fingers tracing the edges. It still didn't feel real. De Niro nodded as if he had been expecting this moment. That's the first step, he said. Now take the next one. Kevin exhaled shakily. He wanted to believe it was that simple, that he could just walk into the shelter, get help, and turn his life around. But doubt clung to him like a shadow. What if I mess this up? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. De Niro gave a small smirk, the kind that had made him famous in his movies. Then you mess it up, he said, and you try again. Kevin stared at him, searching his face for any sign of pity. But there was none, just belief. And that was something he hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. With a deep breath, Kevin slowly stood up, gripping the business card tightly. I guess I should go. De Niro leaned back in his chair, lifting his coffee cup to his lips. Yeah, he said. You should. Kevin hesitated. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he nodded. Thanks. For everything. De Niro didn't say anything at first, just gave him a small, knowing nod. Then, as Kevin turned to leave, his voice cut through the air one last time. Hey, Kevin. Kevin stopped, turning back. De Niro's expression softened, just slightly. Don't waste it. Kevin felt a lump rise in his throat. I won't, he promised. And then, for the first time in years, he walked toward something instead of away. Weeks passed. Kevin's first steps were shaky, uncertain. But they were steps. The shelter took him in. They gave him food, a bed, and more importantly, a sense of worth. They helped him get a temporary job at a warehouse. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. Each day he worked. He saved. He started believing in himself again. One night, after a long shift, he sat on his bed in the shelter and pulled out a pen. He wrote a letter. Mr. De Niro, I don't know if you remember me, but I just wanted to say, you were right. My story wasn't over. And thanks to you, I'm finally writing the next chapter. He never expected a response, but one day in a small office in New York, Robert De Niro sat at his desk, reading that letter. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with a few other old mementos, reminders of moments that had mattered. For him, it was never about recognition. It was about passing it forward. And somewhere out there, Kevin was doing the same. Because sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever. If this story moved you, like, share, and subscribe to inspire more kindness. Comment your thoughts below, and let's spread hope together.